The bullet that had killed Emmett Brenner's brother had been fired on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1876, and not one sunrise since had passed without Emmett thinking about the man who pulled that trigger. He had ridden out of Laramie, Wyoming, on a gray horse with $30 in his coat pocket, and a single name carved so deep into his chest it might as well have been a brand: Cole Hargrove. That name was the first thing Emmett heard when he woke, and the last thing he whispered before sleep took him. 5 years of tracking, 5 years of near misses and cold trails and saloons full of men who knew nothing, 5 years of sleeping with one eye open and one hand on the grip of his Colt, and now the trail had finally gone warm again. Cole Hargrove was in the town of Redemption, New Mexico Territory, and Emmett Brenner was 3 miles out with the late September sun at his back, and murder sitting quietly in his heart like a stone at the bottom of a river. The land around him was the kind of beautiful that made no apologies. Red clay bluffs rose on either side of the narrow road, crowned with yellow grass that shivered in the dry wind. A hawk circled above without a sound. The gray horse, whose name was Calico for reasons that made sense only in the way old habit makes sense, moved at a steady walk because Emmett had learned long ago that urgency caused mistakes, and he could not afford a mistake. Not now. Not after 5 years. He was 28 years old and looked older. The sun had done its work on him, carving lines beside his eyes and bleaching the dark stubble on his jaw to something closer to dust. He wore a battered brown hat, a canvas coat that had been repaired at both elbows with leather cut from a belt, and boots that had walked more miles than most men would admit to in polite company. There was nothing remarkable about him at first glance which had always been useful. Remarkable men got remembered. Emmett preferred to pass through towns like weather felt but not named afterward. He crested a low rise and saw the road drop down into a long flat stretch before it curved toward Redemption's church steeple, visible even at this distance, white as a tooth against the blue sky. 3 miles, maybe less. His jaw tightened. He had played this moment in his mind 1,000 times. What he would say, what he would do, whether he would give Cole Hargrove a single breath of warning or simply collect what was owed. He had not settled on an answer yet, but his body already knew what his mind was still debating. He was 2 miles out when he saw her. She was standing in the exact center of the road, not to one side, not near the ditch that ran along the left shoulder, but square in the middle with her feet planted as though the earth had asked her to hold it down. She was wearing a pale blue dress that the wind was having its own conversation with, and her brown hair had mostly escaped from whatever arrangement it had started the morning in, so that loose strands crossed her face, and she was not bothering to push them back. She was holding a carpetbag in one hand. In the other she held what appeared to be a wooden sign that read, in letters so large and desperate they could have been read from a moving train, "Help." Emmett pulled Calico up. The horse stopped obligingly and swished his tail. Emmett studied the woman the way he studied anything unexpected, which was carefully and without the immediate commitment of any particular expression. She studied him back. Even from 50 yards he could see that she was not going to move, not a sidestep, not a yielding lean. She had chosen her ground, and she intended to stand on it. He walked Calico forward slowly, and when he was near enough to see her eyes he saw they were a gray-green that he had no previous reference for, the color of sage after rain, and they were looking at him with an expression that was 1 part hope and approximately 3 parts absolute refusal to be ignored. "You are going to have to go around me," she said when he was within conversation distance, "unless you are willing to stop." Emmett looked to the left. The ditch was perhaps 2 feet deep and filled with loose shale. He looked to the right, a stretch of soft red clay that would take Calico to the fetlock in 1 step. He looked back at her. "Road is not wide enough to go around," he said. "No," she agreed, "it is not." There was a pause in which neither of them spoke, and the hawk above continued its disinterested orbit. "What do you need?" he asked. "Assistance." She lifted the carpetbag slightly, as though its weight was relevant evidence. My wagon broke an axle approximately 3 miles back. My horse cut his left foreleg on the wheel when it gave, and I had to let him go because I could not do anything for him out there, and I needed him to find shade. There is a man in the town ahead of me who does not know I am coming, and I have reason to believe that if I arrive on foot and alone, he will have time to prepare a version of events that will make what happened seem like something other than what it was. I cannot afford for that to happen. She paused. So I need a ride, and you are the first person to come down this road in 4 hours. Emmett looked at her for a long moment. She was, he estimated, somewhere near his own age, perhaps 25 or 26, with cheekbones that sun and wind had given color to, and a set to her mouth that suggested she had been reasonable with people a great many times already today, and had very little reasonable left in her. "I have somewhere to be," he said. "So do I." The hawk banked and disappeared behind a bluff. The wind moved the loose strands of hair across her face again, and she still did not push them back. Something about that detail settled in Emmett's chest in a way he could not immediately categorize. "What is the man's name?" he asked. "The one in town." "Cole Hargrove," she said. The name hit him the same way cold water hits a man who has walked 40 miles in summer heat, a full-body recognition that was almost painful in its clarity. He stared at her. She stared back. "Why do you need to see Cole Hargrove?" he asked, and his voice came out carefully, the way a man's voice does when he is keeping something very still inside him. "Because he took my land," she said. "He forged my late husband's signature on a deed transfer and filed it in the county seat 18 months ago. I have been in Santa Fe for the past 4 months gathering evidence and speaking to a federal land agent, and I have documents in this bag that prove what he did. But if he knows I am coming before I walk into that sheriff's office, those documents will not matter because things have a way of happening to people who cross Cole Hargrove in redemption." She said it plainly, without drama, the way a woman says a thing she has turned over so many times in her mind that all the sharp edges have worn smooth. "So, do you intend to give me a ride or not?" Emmett Brenner sat on his horse in the middle of a red clay road in the New Mexico Territory in the year 1881 and looked at the woman standing in front of him, who was carrying evidence against the man he had ridden toward with murder in his heart for 5 years. And he understood with absolute clarity that whatever he had been planning to do in redemption today was going to require significant revision. He reached down his right hand. She took it. Her grip was firm and practical, and she did not require any assistance beyond the initial pull. She settled herself behind him on calico with the carpetbag across her lap and arranged her skirts in a businesslike manner, and Calico, who was a horse of mild temperament and no strong opinions about unexpected passengers, adjusted his balance and waited. "My name is Esther Whitaker," she said. "Emmett Brenner," he said. "You know Cole Hargrove." It was not a question. She had heard something in his voice when he said the name, or perhaps she simply read people the way some people read terrain, naturally and without effort. "I have been looking for him for 5 years," Emmett said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What did he do?" He clicked his tongue and Calico moved forward. The road stretched ahead of them toward the white steeple and the yellow grass hills, and the town where a man who did not know this day was coming was going about his Tuesday morning. "He killed my brother," Emmett said. She did not say she was sorry. People said they were sorry so often it had become a kind of verbal furniture, present in every difficult room but not doing anything. Instead she said, "How old was your brother?" And the question went straight into the part of Emmett that never got asked anything real. 22, he said. "What was his name?" "Daniel." She was quiet again, and the silence was a different kind of silence from the one that follows empty words. It was the kind that means someone is actually holding what you just told them. "Daniel Brenner," she said, as if she was making note of it, as if his brother deserved to be noted. Something unlocked in Emmett's throat. He did not trust it, so he kept his eyes on the road and said nothing else for a while, but the silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of two strangers. It had become something more like shared air, which was different. The road bent south, and the town came into fuller view. Redemption was the size and shape of every other territory town that had found itself along a trade route and decided to stay. A main street wide enough for two wagons to pass each other badly. A dozen storefronts with wooden facades trying their best to look permanent. A livery at one end and the jail at the other. A church planted in the middle of everything like a conscience nobody had asked for. The population was perhaps 300, swelled on Fridays and Saturdays by the ranching crews from the surrounding land. It was a Tuesday. "The sheriff," Esther said as they neared the first buildings. "Do you know anything about him? Man named Dillard." "I have never met him, but I spoke with a land agent in Socorro who said he runs a clean office." "A land agent told you that?" "I have been learning things about this town for the better part of a year," Emmett said, building a picture. "You plan to simply ride in and shoot him," she said. Emmett did not deny it. "I considered it. And now?" He turned onto the main street and felt the familiar weight of being in a new town, the eyes that tracked a stranger from behind glass windows and from beneath hat brims without ever quite meeting the stranger's gaze. There were perhaps 8 people visible on the street. A man sweeping the steps of the general store. 2 women in conversation outside what appeared to be a milliner's, a boy leading a mule. "Now I think you should go to the sheriff's office first," Emmett said. "Show him what you have. Let the law handle it the way the law is supposed to handle it." He paused. "And if the law fails to handle it, then we will discuss what comes next." Esther shifted slightly behind him. He could feel her thinking. "You would wait," she said. "I have waited 5 years. I can wait an afternoon." She was quiet. "Then, why does it matter to you whether I use the law or you use a gun?" "Because if you use the law and it works," Emmett said slowly, working it out as he spoke, "then Cole Hargrove sits in a jail cell and answers for what he did to your land and what he did to my brother in front of a judge in a court, and it is on record and it cannot be undone. If I ride in and put a bullet in him, none of that happens, and whether it was justice or not, every person in this territory will see a drifter riding in to settle a private score." He paused. "Daniel deserved better than that. Your land deserves better than that." She did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was quieter. "My husband's name was Robert Whitaker. He died of fever 2 winters ago. We had built that ranch together for 7 years, every fence post and water trough. We had a daughter. She is 4 years old and she is staying with my sister in Santa Fe right now, and I told her I would come home with the ranch or I would not come back at all." She paused, which was perhaps dramatic, but I meant it. "How old is your daughter?" Emmett asked. "Clara. She is 4. Another pause. "I am 25 years old, Mr. Brenner, and I am absolutely exhausted, and I need this to work today." "Then let us make it work," he said. He brought Calico to a stop in front of the sheriff's office, which had a faded star painted on the door and a bench outside, where a deputy of approximately 17 was sitting with his feet up and his hat over his face. The deputy heard the horse and pushed the hat up with one finger, regarded them with the practiced indifference of someone who had been told to look official, and then appeared to make a genuine assessment of Esther and revised his posture to something more upright. "Help you folks," the deputy said. "We need to speak with Sheriff Dillard," Esther said, and something in her voice was different now, leveled and clear, the voice of a woman who had made her decision about exactly how this conversation would go. "I have legal documents pertaining to a land fraud case that I intend to file today. This is urgent." The deputy stood up. "He is inside," he said. "I will tell him." Emmett swung down from Calico and tied him to the post, then helped Esther down. She led him briefly, before her feet found the ground, and she was moving toward the door with the carpetbag held firmly at her side. The inside of the sheriff's office smelled like pipe tobacco and old wood, and the particular staleness of a room where men had conducted serious business for a long time. There was a desk, a rifle rack, a wood stove, and 3 cells at the back that were currently empty. Sheriff Dillard was a heavy-set man of perhaps 50 with a gray mustache, and eyes that assessed things in the same unhurried way that a blacksmith assesses iron, Not unpleasant about it, just thorough. He looked at Esther and then at Emmett and then back at Esther. "Sheriff," she said, "my name is Esther Whitaker. My late husband Robert Whitaker held a deed to 420 acres of land in the Cimarron Valley, registered in 1873. In the spring of 1880, a deed transfer was filed in the county seat in Cimarron, bearing my husband's signature and transferring ownership to a man named Cole Hargrove. My husband died in January of 1879. She set the carpetbag on his desk, opened it, and began laying out documents with the efficiency of a woman who had organized this moment many times in her mind. These are the original deed in my husband's name, dated 1873. These are records from the county seat showing the date of filing for the transfer. This is a certified copy of my husband's death certificate from the physician in Cimarron who attended him. And this," she said, placing a sealed envelope at the front of the row, "is a letter from Federal Land Agent William H. Frost of the Santa Fe office stating that in his professional examination, the signature on the transfer document is inconsistent with authenticated samples of Robert Whitaker's signature and presents indicators of forgery." Dillard had not moved since she started talking. He looked at the documents. He looked at her. He pulled his chair forward and sat down and picked up the first document with both hands and read it. The room was very quiet. Outside, Calico made a comment about something. Emmett stood near the door with his hat in his hands and said nothing. This was not his moment. He recognized that with a clarity that surprised him. Esther Whitaker had done 4 months of work to build this case, and she had walked 3 miles to find someone to bring her to this room, and she deserved to have it be entirely hers. Dillard read for several minutes. He read the federal agent's letter twice. He set it down and looked at Esther with the kind of attention that meant he was deciding how much of what she was saying he already believed. "Cole Hargrove currently runs a cattle operation on the land in question," Dillard said. "I am aware," Esther said. "He has been doing so for the past 16 months. He has men working for him, 7 or 8 of them. I am also aware of that." Dillard was quiet for a moment. He looked at Emmett. "And you, son, what is your business here?" Emmett met his gaze. "My name is Emmett Brenner. Cole Hargrove shot and killed my brother Daniel Brenner in Laramie, Wyoming in April of 1876. There was a witness whose name was Thomas Riggs, and Thomas Riggs disappeared before he could testify. He kept his voice even. I have been tracking Hargrove for 5 years. I have no complaint with the law. I would like the law to address what needs addressing." Dillard studied him for a long moment, the way a man studies a burning fuse to decide how long he has. Something in his expression shifted. "I had a wire from a marshal out of Cimarron 3 weeks ago," Dillard said slowly, "asking about a land dispute. I will not pretend I did not already have questions about Cole Hargrove, because I did. He came to this town 18 months ago with money and men and a story that held together fine on the surface." He paused. "The surface was always the part I found suspicious." He stood up. "I am going to wire the marshal, and I am going to ride out to the Hargrove place this afternoon. I need both of you to stay in town and stay available. Mrs. Whitaker, is there a place you are staying?" "I had not yet arranged one," she said. "There is a boarding house on the north end of the street run by a woman named Ada Coles. Tell her I sent you." He picked up the documents carefully and began placing them in the order they would need to be in for a formal filing. "Mr. Brenner, I appreciate your restraint." "Do not thank me yet," Emmett said. Dillard gave him a look that was almost a smile. "No," he agreed. "I suppose not." They came out into the afternoon sun and stood on the step for a moment without speaking. The main street of Redemption went about its business around them as though nothing of particular consequence had just occurred inside that wood frame office, which was, Emmett reflected, the way most important things happened, quietly with the world looking in the other direction. "You did well in there," he said. Esther looked at him. The afternoon light had shifted the color of her eyes again, less sage now and more the gray of distant rain. She was tired. He could see it in the way she was holding herself, carefully, The way a person holds themselves when they have been careful for a very long time, and the effort is beginning to show. I have been rehearsing that conversation for 4 months, she said. It showed in the best possible way. She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a breath. I need to sit down, she said. I need water, I need food. I may need to cry in private for approximately 5 minutes, but I intend to do that after I eat. Emmett looked up the street. There was a small restaurant beside the general store, its sign visible from here. He looked back at her. I owe you a meal, he said, for standing in the road. That got a real smile. It changed her face considerably, and he found himself wanting to note the fact the way she had noted his brother's name, as something that deserved to be acknowledged. You do, she said. Let us go. They went to the restaurant, which was run by a Mexican family and smelled like chili peppers and something roasting that Emmett could not identify but responded to with considerable enthusiasm. There were 4 tables and a bar-style counter, and a woman of perhaps 60 with silver-streaked hair who brought them water and a basket of bread without being asked, which Emmett considered evidence of good character. Esther ate with the focused attention of someone who had not done so properly in some time. He did not try to fill the silence while she ate. He ate his own food, which was excellent, and watched the street through the window and thought about Cole Hargrove, and about the fact that he had not felt the familiar pull of his gun hand since he had stopped for Esther on the road, and tried to decide what that meant. Tell me about your brother, she said, when the plates were half cleared and the worst of her hunger had been addressed. If you want to. Daniel was 5 years younger than me, Emmett said. He found that the words came easier than he expected. We grew up outside of Laramie on a small farm. Our father was a decent man who died young. Our mother did everything a person could do to hold things together and held them together until Daniel and I were old enough to be some use to her. He paused. Daniel was the kind of person who made things feel lighter, not because he was foolish or ignored difficulty, but because he genuinely believed things could be better than they were. He had plans. He was going to have a ranch in Colorado. He had a girl he was going to marry. He picked up his coffee. Her name was Lucy. She married someone else 4 years ago. I hope she is happy. What happened? Esther asked. With Cole Hargrove. There was a card game, Emmett said. Daniel was not a gambling man, but he had found work on a trail drive that had come through Laramie, and he had money in his pocket, and he sat down at a table in a saloon. Cole Hargrove was at the same table. Daniel won. Cole said he cheated. Daniel told him he had not. He set the coffee down. Cole shot him for it, in front of 6 people. 3 of those people worked for Cole. 2 left town before the week was out. Thomas Riggs was the only one who stayed, and he told the deputy what he saw, and then Cole got to Thomas Riggs before the law could, and Thomas Riggs was never seen again. He was quiet for a moment. I believe Thomas Riggs is dead. I have believed it for 5 years. Esther had stopped eating. She was looking at him with an expression that was not pity, which he was grateful for. It was something more careful than pity, more specific. You have been carrying that alone, she said. My mother died 3 years ago. She never stopped waiting for justice. I promised her it would come. He paused. I intend to keep that promise. You will, she said, and said it with a certainty that had nothing performative about it. She said it as a simple statement of a thing she believed, the way someone says the sun comes up in the east. What you brought to that sheriff today, combined with what I brought, there is enough. He will not be able to walk away from this. If the law fails, Emmett said. If the law fails, she said, we will think of something else. And the way she said we was quiet and even as if she had not noticed herself say it, as if it was simply the natural word for the situation. He noticed. They found Ada Coles's boarding house, which was a tidy building with window boxes full of late-season flowers, and a proprietress who was exactly as competent and plain-spoken as a woman recommended by a sheriff tended to be. Ada Coles was a widow of approximately 45 with the bearing of someone who had managed difficult things with grace and had no intention of doing otherwise. She gave Esther a room with a window that looked east, which Esther said was important to her, and she let Emmett have the room at the end of the hall for a fair price and without any particular comment on the arrangement, which Emmett appreciated. By the time they were settled, it was mid-afternoon. Emmett came back downstairs and sat on the front porch of the boarding house with his hat pushed back on his head and watched the street and thought about patience, which was the thing that had kept him alive for 5 years and which was now being required of him in a different and more complicated way. Esther came and sat in the other chair. She had put her hair back up and changed into what appeared to be her second-best dress, the carpetbag apparently containing more than just documents. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the same street. "I keep thinking about Clara," she said. "She has never been apart from me for more than a night." "How long have you been away?" 4 months and 11 days. "She is being well cared for. My sister Margaret is wonderful with children. Margaret has 3 of her own." She paused. "It does not stop me from thinking about her every hour." "What is she like?" Something shifted in Esther's expression, the way a window shifts when the light moves behind it. "She is very serious," she said, and there was profound love in the word serious, the specific love of a parent for a quality in their child that everyone else might miss. "She says exactly what she means. She has no patience for anything that is not true. When she was 3, she told a neighbor woman who said she had a lovely hat that the hat was not lovely, it was brown and unfortunate." She paused. "The neighbor was not pleased. I was struggling not to laugh." She paused. "She has Robert's eyes, dark brown. Very direct." "She sounds remarkable," Emmett said. "She is the best thing that ever happened to me," Esther said simply. "Then, I think the ranch is the second best thing, or was. Robert and I built it from nothing. When I walk back onto that land, I want her to be able to grow up there the way I always intended for her to grow up there." She looked at her hands. "I want her to have what her father and I made for her." "She will," he said. She looked at him. "You sound very certain. You stood in the middle of a road and stopped a strange man on a horse because you needed a ride," he said. "You are exactly as stubborn as this situation requires." Her mouth curved. "My mother called it pig-headed." "Your mother and I would have agreed on the description," he said, "not on whether it was a flaw." She looked at him again with that careful attention, and he found himself wishing he had something more to show it, something more than a battered hat and 5 years of accumulated dust. Sheriff Dillard returned at 5 o'clock with 2 deputies and a man in a brown suit who turned out to be the county marshal from Cimarron, who had apparently been in redemption on unrelated business and had received Dillard's wire at the hotel. They came down the main street at a walking pace, and behind them, hands tied to the saddle horn and expression arranged into something that was trying to be contempt but kept slipping into something else, was Cole Hargrove. Emmett stood up from the boarding house porch when he saw them. Esther stood beside him. He felt her go still. Cole Hargrove was not what Emmett had been expecting, although he had worked hard over 5 years not to build an expectation. He was a man of perhaps 50, lean and weathered, with a silver-gray hat and the kind of handsome that had probably opened doors for him at every stop between Wyoming and New Mexico. He sat his horse with ease despite the bound hands. His eyes, as the group passed the boarding house, moved across Emmett with no recognition at all, and then they found Esther Whitaker and they stopped. There it was, the recognition. And in the recognition, something that went briefly and unmistakably cold. Esther held his gaze without flinching. She had been imagining this moment for months, Emmett guessed, the moment Cole Hargrove understood that what he thought he had gotten away with was coming undone. She did not smile. She simply stood there with her spine straight and her hands at her sides and let him look. Hargrove said nothing. The group passed. Dillard glanced at Emmett as he went by and gave a small nod that meant things were in hand, and Emmett was not needed, which was both a relief and a strange kind of deflation. 5 years of purpose suddenly shifting to something quieter. "He is going to jail tonight," Esther said. Her voice was controlled. Her hands, Emmett noticed, were shaking slightly. "Yes," he said. She breathed in through her nose. "Good," she said. They had supper with Ada Coles, who turned out to be the best kind of conversationalist, the kind who asks about other people's lives with genuine interest and offers observations about her own without requiring anyone to pretend those observations are more interesting than they are. She had come to New Mexico from Tennessee 12 years ago with a husband who had subsequently decided he preferred the California coast to the territory, and she had decided she preferred to stay where she was. "The arrangement suited us both," she said, without apparent bitterness. "He sends a letter at Christmas, and I read it and wish him well, and that is approximately the correct amount of Harold in my life." Emmett liked her immediately. After supper, he sat in the small parlor that Ada maintained for her boarders and read a 2-week-old newspaper while Esther wrote a letter to her sister. He could hear the pen moving across the paper from where he sat, a small regular sound that he found he did not want to stop. When she finished, she folded the letter and addressed it and set it down on the table. "I need to go to the sheriff's office tomorrow morning," she said. "Give a formal statement for the record." "I know," he said. "I need to do the same." She looked at him. And after that, he thought about it. He had been asking himself the same question. Cole Hargrove was in a jail cell 50 yards from where he sat. The man who had shot Daniel Brenner in a card game in Laramie, Wyoming in 1876 was in custody in Redemption, New Mexico, and by tomorrow morning there would be a formal record of it. It would go to a judge. There would be a trial. Emmett would need to testify, which meant staying in Redemption for a while, which meant something was going to have to be figured out in terms of work and accommodation. "I will need to stay for the trial," he said. "So will I," she said. "My documents are evidence. I will need to testify about the land transfer." "Then we are both staying," he said. "Yes," she said. She looked at the folded letter on the table. "I should wire my sister tomorrow as well. Tell her it may be a few more weeks." She paused. "She will ask me to describe the town. She always asks me to describe places." "What will you tell her?" "That it has a great deal of red clay and a church someone is very proud of, and a boarding house that makes better supper than anything I have eaten in 4 months." She considered. "And that I am not alone here, which will make her ask questions." Emmett set down the newspaper. "What kind of questions?" She looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who has decided to be direct about something and is doing her best to be direct about it gracefully. "My sister has been trying to arrange a situation for me since approximately 6 weeks after Robert died. She has a very good heart and an absolutely relentless commitment to my happiness that expresses itself primarily through introducing me to widowers and business-minded young men from respectable families." She paused. "I have been spectacularly uninterested in every single one of them." "Why?" he asked, and then thought that was perhaps too direct a question for a man who had known her for 7 hours, but she did not seem to think so. "Because being introduced to someone is not the same as meeting them," she said. "I met Robert Whitaker because we were both reaching for the same book in a lending library in Kansas City when I was 17 years old." He apologized. "I told him he could have it because I had already read it twice, and it was better the second time." He asked what book could possibly be better the second time. She smiled. "We talked for 2 hours. I thought about him for 6 months before he found his way back to Kansas City. When he did, I already knew." Emmett was quiet for a moment. "And the widowers your sister introduced you to," he said. "None of them reached for the same book. None of them read books," she said, which was its own kind of answer. He smiled. He found he had been smiling more in the past 8 hours than he had in the previous 8 months, which was information he was not entirely sure what to do with. "I stopped in a lending library in Cimarron 6 months ago," he said. "They had a copy of David Copperfield with the cover falling off. I read it in a week." She looked at him. Something in her expression shifted again, and she did not try to hide where it had shifted to. "Mr. Brenner," she said. "Emmett," he said. "Emmett," she said. "I'm going to go to bed because I have not slept properly in 4 days, and I intend to tomorrow morning to be sharp and steady when I walk into that sheriff's office, and this may be the last comfortable night I have for a while." She stood up. She picked up her letter. "But I would like to know," she added, and her voice was very careful, "whether you intend to still be here when the trial is over." He looked up at her. The lamplight in the parlor was warm and low, and it made the gray-green of her eyes something else entirely, something that did not have a name he knew. "I intend to be here," he said. She nodded once, as if this was the information she had wanted. "Good night, Emmett," she said. "Good night, Esther." She went up the stairs, and the sound of her footsteps faded, and he sat in the lamplight for a long time before he went to bed himself. In the morning the air was cool and clear in the way that mornings in New Mexico territory are sometimes cool and clear, a cleanness to the sky that feels like something has been forgiven. Emmett had slept deeply, which surprised him. He had expected to lie awake thinking about Daniel, about the trial, about all the things 5 years of determination left behind when the object of the determination was suddenly sitting in a jail cell, and all the forward motion had nowhere left to go. But he had slept like a man who had set something down after a very long walk. He came down to find Esther already at the breakfast table, talking to Ada Coles about the boarding house garden, which apparently faced a persistent threat from a particular species of beetle that Ada had opinions about. Esther was listening with real attention and responding with suggestions based on what sounded like practical experience with a kitchen garden, and Ada was writing one of the suggestions down on a scrap of paper, and the scene was so entirely domestic and warm that Emmett stopped in the doorway for a moment before either of them noticed him. When they did, Ada said good morning and poured him coffee, and Esther said good morning without the particular care she had used the night before, which meant she was comfortable, and he sat down at the table and ate scrambled eggs and bread and drank coffee and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the morning was simply a morning and not a waypoint on a road to something terrible. They went to the sheriff's office together. The county marshal, whose name was Hendricks, was already there. He was a younger man than Dillard, perhaps 35, with an efficient manner and a tendency to take notes while someone was speaking, which Emmett respected. He took their statements separately, which was proper procedure, and after he had taken Esther's, he came to speak with Emmett in the back office. "The documents Mrs. Whitaker presented," Hendricks said, "combined with the physical evidence and the statement of a ranch hand who left Hargrove's employ last month and is currently in Cimarron, are sufficient for a formal indictment on land fraud and forgery." He paused. "Your testimony regarding the 1876 incident in Laramie will require coordination with the Wyoming territorial authorities, but I have already wired them and I expect a response in the next few days." He looked at his notes. "Thomas Riggs," he said. "The witness," Emmett said. "We found a name consistent with that in records from a mining camp near Silver City, dated 1877. A man who went by Tom Riggs died of injuries sustained in a mining accident. No relation to Hargrove that I can find, but the timing is interesting." He paused. "I think Cole Hargrove understood that Thomas Riggs was a problem that would eventually find its way back to him, and I think he solved that problem the way he solved most problems." Emmett absorbed this. "He did not kill Thomas Riggs himself," he said. "No, I do not believe so, but a man like Hargrove has ways of making difficult situations resolve themselves." Hendricks looked at him steadily. "I want to ask you something directly, Mr. Brenner. Ask it. When you rode into this town yesterday, what were your intentions regarding Cole Hargrove?" The room was quiet. Outside, the sound of the main street, a horse, a door, someone calling to someone else. "I intended to confront him," Emmett said. "I had not decided what form that confrontation would take." Hendricks looked at him for a long moment. "A woman standing in the road made the decision for you." "She made it easier to make the right decision," Emmett said. "I believe I would have made it anyway." "Do you?" Hendricks said. "I hope I would have," Emmett said. "I am less certain than I was yesterday morning about what I am capable of." "That seems like the honest answer." Hendricks wrote something down. He looked up. "Thank you for your honesty," he said. "Stay in town. We will need you for the trial." Emmett came out of the office and found Esther waiting on the bench outside. She looked at him and read something in his face. "Are you all right?" she asked. He sat down beside her. The morning sun was full on the street now, and a woman across the road was shaking a rug out of a second-floor window with an expression of focused personal grievance toward the rug itself. "I told the marshal I was not certain what I would have done if you had not been in the road," he said. She was quiet. "Do you think it is true?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "I think it is possible I would have ridden into this town and found out about your land and about the evidence you had and made the same decision anyway. But I also think it is possible I would not have." He looked at the street. "I am grateful that I did not have to find out." She put her hand over his where it rested on his knee. It was a brief contact, matter of fact, the way she had gripped his hand on the road when he helped her up. But she left it there a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and he turned his hand over so that they were briefly palm to palm before she withdrew hers. "You stopped," she said. "That is the part that matters." He nodded. "Come on," she said, standing. "Ada mentioned there is a store on the edge of town that has fabric and I need thread, and you look like your coat requires more leather." He looked at his elbows. "It does," he said. "Then we have a practical morning ahead of us," she said, and started walking, and he stood up and followed her because it was the most natural thing in the world to do. The days that followed had a quality that Emmett would not have been able to predict and could not quite describe, even to himself. They were waiting days, the trial date set for 3 weeks out. Hargrove in custody with a bail amount set high enough that even his connections could not easily move it. The ranch hands who had worked Hargrove's operation mostly dispersed, which was not ideal from a labor standpoint, but saved everyone in redemption the concern of 8 armed men with loyalties that no longer had an obvious object. 2 of them, as it turned out, had their own grievances against their former employer and proved useful to the marshal's ongoing collection of evidence. Emmett, for the first time in 5 years, had no particular place to be and no horse to point at a destination. He found work at the livery stable, which was run by a man named Oscar Fenn, who was 60 and arthritic, and needed someone who could manage the heavy lifting while he managed everything else. The pay was modest but sufficient, and the hours left the early mornings and the evenings free. Oscar talked constantly and entertainingly about everything and everyone in redemption, and within 4 days Emmett knew more about the town than he had learned in his year of gathering information about it, including that the Hargrove operation had been unpopular with several of the surrounding ranchers who had found his business methods aggressive, that Sheriff Dillard had been working on the land fraud angle for 3 months before Esther arrived, and that Ada Coles made the best apple pie in the New Mexico territory, and was known to be very particular about who received a piece of it. Esther, for her part, was not the kind of woman who waited passively. She hired herself out to help the milliner 3 mornings a week, having some background in sewing, and she helped Ada in the boarding house kitchen in exchange for a reduction in her room rate. She wrote long letters to her sister and shorter, more precise letters to her daughter, which Clara apparently had read to her by their aunt because Clara was 4 and could not yet read herself. And she sent back letters in Clara's 4-year-old handwriting that said things like, "I saw a horse," and "You have been gone a long time, Mama," in letters of varying size that Esther sometimes read aloud to Emmett at the supper table, and which made Ada laugh and made Emmett feel something warm and complex in the region of his sternum. He and Esther walked together most evenings. There was a road that ran north from the edge of town toward a pair of cottonwood trees by a dry creek bed, and in the September and early October evenings, the light was extraordinary in the way that desert light is extraordinary, everything gold and long-shadowed and precisely detailed. They walked and they talked. He told her about Laramie, about his mother, about the years of the trail. She told him about the ranch in the Cimarron Valley, about Robert, about the years of building something from bare land with their own hands. Neither of them was performing. Neither of them was trying to sound better or worse than they were. They were simply talking, the way two people talk when they have independently determined that there is no reasonable point in being anything other than honest. One evening, near the end of the second week, she stopped walking and turned to look at the mountains to the west, which were doing something spectacular with the last of the day's light, the kind of thing that makes people stop speaking. "I have been thinking," she said, still watching the mountains, "about what happens after the trial." "Tell me," he said. "I will get the ranch back," she said. It was not a question. The federal agent's documentation and the marshal's case had made it a near certainty, and she had stopped phrasing it as a hope somewhere in the past week. "I will go back to Cimarron, and I will bring Clara home, and I will start putting it to rights. There has been cattle run on it for 18 months under Hargrove's management, and I will need to assess what condition the land is in, and what the fencing looks like, and whether the water situation in the south pasture has been properly maintained, because Robert always worried about the south pasture." She paused. "I will need help, real help. Not just hired hands for the season, but someone who understands the kind of work that building something means." He looked at her profile against the sunset. "I am very good with horses," he said. She turned to look at him. The last light of the day caught her face in a way that made the gray-green of her eyes exactly the color of the sage on the hillside behind her. "I know you are," she said. "I watched you settle your horse after a 4-hour ride in 1 minute flat." "I was raised on a farm," he said. "I know cattle and horses and fencing and water. I can build and I can repair. I am not unacquainted with a hard year." "No," she said, "you are not." "Esther," he said, and his voice came out differently than he had intended it to, less measured. "I am not suggesting an arrangement. I am not proposing to trade labor for accommodation." He paused. "I am saying that I have been walking toward something dark for 5 years, and I have walked out the other side of it, and I am in the unusual position of not knowing what direction to go next. And when I try to think about directions, this is the only one that has anything in it worth going toward." She was very still. The mountain behind her had gone from gold to deep rose. "That is a great deal to say on a walk," she said, but her voice was not putting any distance into the observation. "Something more careful than that." "I know it is too soon," he said. "I know you are still wearing a grief that belongs to someone who deserved it. I'm not asking you to set that down. I'm asking whether I am someone you can see in the road ahead." The light faded to purple. A coyote called somewhere on the far hills. The cottonwoods made their papery sound in the night breeze. "Clara," she said, not as a refusal but as a question. "Tell me about her favorite things," he said, "not to prove something. Because I want to know." She looked at him for a long time in the cooling dark. Then she said, "She loves horses most of all. She also loves a specific wooden doll that is missing one arm and has been missing it since she was 2, and nobody knows where the arm went. She loves bread with butter, but she removes the crust and leaves it in a ring around the plate, which drives my sister absolutely to distraction." She paused. "She is afraid of thunder, but she will not admit she is afraid of thunder, because she does not like to admit fear. She says the thunder is simply very loud and she does not enjoy very loud things." Emmett was quiet for a moment. "She sounds like her mother," he said. Esther laughed, a real one, surprised out of her, and the sound of it went out into the desert evening and hung there for a second in the good air. "She is exactly like her mother," she agreed. "Robert used to say he had created a second version of me with no improvements and no modifications, and that he considered this a complete success." "He sounds like a man who paid attention," Emmett said. "He was," she said softly. "He truly was." She looked at her hands for a moment, then she looked at him. "When you say you can see the ranch ahead," she said, "yes. You mean the ranch and Clara and all of it." "All of it," he said. "Whatever all of it turns out to be. At whatever pace all of it turns out to require." She nodded slowly, and in the nodding was a yes that was also an understanding, a careful yes, a yes that had its eyes open but unmistakably a yes. "Then I suppose," she said, "you should come to Cimarron." He released a breath he had not entirely known he was holding. "I suppose I should," he said. They stood there in the last of the light for a moment longer, and then they walked back toward the lights of redemption together, and neither of them needed to say anything else that evening. The trial of Cole Hargrove began on a Thursday morning in the third week of October, 1881, in the Redemption Courthouse, which was a room attached to the back of the sheriff's office that had been expanded twice and still was not quite large enough for everything that needed to happen in it. The county judge, a man named Beauchamp who came up from Las Cruces, was compact and precise, and ran the proceedings with the kind of efficiency that suggested he had sat in a lot of small courtrooms and understood exactly how much could go wrong in them if you gave witnesses time to be more interesting than they needed to be. The territorial prosecutor presented the land fraud case first, and it was thorough. Esther's documents, the federal agent's letter, the testimony of the Cimarron County Records clerk who had processed the fraudulent deed transfer with no reason at the time to question it, the statement of the ranch hand who had heard Hargrove discuss the forged deed with a business associate in what he had believed to be a private conversation. Hargrove's attorney was competent, but had limited material to work with. The signature on the deed transfer was not Robert Whitaker's signature, and 5 different documents made that abundantly clear. Esther testified for 40 minutes. She was composed and specific and the kind of credible that comes from having lived the events you are describing and knowing every detail because they are your life and not a rehearsed account. She spoke about the ranch, about Robert, about the years of work, about discovering the deed transfer when she tried to renew a water right, and was told by the county office that the land was no longer in her name. She spoke about the 4 months in Santa Fe and what she had learned and what she had brought back. She did not perform her grief or her anger. She stated facts and let the facts speak with the considerable eloquence they were capable of. When she came back to her seat beside Emmett in the gallery, her hands were in her lap and she was looking straight ahead and her jaw was very tight. He did not say anything. He did what she had done on the bench outside the sheriff's office on their first full morning in redemption. He put his hand over hers. She turned her hand and gripped it and held it for the rest of the hearing. The Wyoming charges required more technical argument. The territorial prosecutor had coordinated with his Wyoming counterpart by wire and mail, and the affidavits from Laramie were entered into evidence along with the records of the original investigation. Emmett testified. He told the court what he had seen and what he had been told in the immediate aftermath of his brother's death, and he told it plainly and without the years of anger that had lived inside him, because he had decided before he took the stand that this room, this record, deserved the clearest possible version of what had happened, not the version that had been grinding inside him for 5 years. Hargrove's attorney argued that the Wyoming matter was separate from the land fraud case and should be heard in a separate venue. Judge Beauchamp agreed in principle, but noted that the evidence of a consistent pattern of criminal behavior across multiple instances and multiple territories was relevant to sentencing if not to the specific charge, and that the Wyoming authorities had formally requested that any sentence handed down be served prior to extradition. On the second day of the trial, a piece of evidence came forward that nobody had anticipated. Marshal Hendricks had, in the 3 weeks since Hargrove's arrest, followed the thread of Thomas Riggs to its full end. He had found a letter, written in 1877 and never sent, discovered in the effects of a man who had been Hargrove's business manager and had died of natural causes in 1879, a letter from Hargrove to this manager describing the Thomas Riggs situation and what needed to be done about it. It did not use specific words. Men like Cole Hargrove rarely used specific words. But it was clear enough, and the handwriting was identified by 3 different individuals, and it was entered into evidence as Exhibit 41. Emmett sat very still when Hendricks read that letter into the record. He sat still and he breathed and he looked at the table in front of him and he thought about Daniel at 22 with plans for Colorado and a girl named Lucy and a winning hand at cards that had cost him everything, and he felt grief instead of rage, which was different, which was something he had not been able to feel for 5 years because rage had been filling the space where grief needed to go. Esther's hand found his under the table. She did not look at him. He did not look at her. But the contact was steady and real, and it held him in the room. Hargrove was convicted on both counts. The sentence was 20 years in the territorial prison, with the Wyoming extradition to follow upon completion of the New Mexico sentence. It was, as Judge Beauchamp noted in his remarks before sentencing, a severe outcome for a man who had shown no evidence of remorse and considerable evidence of a long pattern of exploiting and destroying the livelihoods of people who had worked honestly for what they had. The land in the Cimarron Valley was formally returned to Esther Whitaker by court order on the same afternoon that the conviction was delivered. The deed transfer declared fraudulent and void, the original deed restored. She received the paper with both hands and held it and did not cry, which Emmett suspected cost her a significant amount. She cried later, in the small parlor at Ada Coles's boarding house, with Ada sitting beside her on the settee and a handkerchief that appeared to belong to Ada pressed to her face. It was not the overwhelming grief cry that comes from loss. It was the other kind, the kind that comes from the release of something that has been held at tremendous cost for a very long time, the kind that sounds partly like laughing, because relief and grief are closer to each other than most people recognize, until they feel both at once. Emmett stood in the doorway of the parlor for a moment and then went out to the porch and sat with his elbows on his knees and his hat in his hands and thought about Daniel, and about his mother, and about the promise he had made and kept, and about the fact that tomorrow he was going to begin the rest of his life. That evening, after supper, Ada Coles brought out an apple pie. She placed it on the table and cut 3 generous pieces and slid them forward and sat back and looked at Emmett across the table with an expression that was entirely aware of what it meant. "This is not a pie I give to everyone," she said. "I understand the honor," he said. "You should," she agreed, and picked up her fork. It was the best pie he had ever eaten. They left Redemption on a Saturday morning at the end of October. Ada Coles saw them off from the front step of the boarding house and shook Emmett's hand and embraced Esther for a long time, and pressed a package of food for the road into his hands, and told them both that they were welcome back any time and that she would expect a letter. "More than one letter," she said, and looked at both of them in a way that managed to be both entirely clear and entirely dignified about what she expected those letters to eventually contain. Emmett had purchased a second horse, a bay mare named Belle by her previous owner and not by him, who had a sensible disposition and a good strong walk. The carpet-bag went into a saddle-bag on the bay, along with the court documents and Esther's sewing kit, and the 2 books she had acquired in Redemption during the 3 weeks of waiting, and the one she had been given by Ada as a parting gift. They rode north out of Redemption in the early morning, with the sky just going pink above the eastern hills, and the road ran ahead of them through the red clay, and the sage, and the yellow grass, and the enormous sky that belonged to the New Mexico territory and nobody else. 3 days to Cimarron, Esther said. "Perhaps 4, given the passes." "4 is fine," Emmett said. She looked at him sideways from the back of the bay mare. The morning light was doing the same thing the evening light had done, finding the color in her eyes, and she was smiling slightly, not a full smile, just the beginning of one, which he had already learned was more reliable than anyone else's full smile. "You do not have anywhere to be," she said. "I am exactly where I intend to be," he said. The ride to Cimarron took 4 days, which was the right amount. The land they moved through was the kind of land that requires attention to be fully received, not the passive reception of a man passing through, but the active engagement of someone who is willing to let it change the scale of his thinking. The mountains to the west were enormous and indifferent and beautiful. The mesas were painted in colors that had no real names in the catalog of colors that Emmett had grown up knowing. The sky was the kind of blue that can only occur at altitude in the western reaches of the continent, a blue that implied infinity without being oppressive about it. They camped 2 nights and spent the third at a stage relay station that had a room to let and a cook who made venison stew that Emmett considered very seriously for the rest of the trip. They talked through all 4 days, the kind of talking that happens between people who have established that there is enough time for everything and that nothing needs to be forced or rushed, the kind of talking that builds something gradually and solidly, like a wall built right. She told him about the ranch in detail. The lay of the land, the spring that fed the north pasture, the barn her father-in-law had helped them build in the 2nd year, the kitchen garden she had given up on in the 3rd year because of the soil, and then started again with different soil preparation in the 4th year, and finally gotten right. She told him about the neighbors, the Garza family to the south who were good people and good ranchers, the Harmon family to the north who were fine as long as you never discussed water rights in their presence. She told him what the land needed and what she hoped to make of it over the next 5 years. He listened and he thought, and he asked questions that were the questions of a man who was genuinely trying to understand the thing being described, and not merely the questions of a man making conversation. She noticed this, he could tell. It changed something in the way she talked, relaxed something, as though she had expected at some point to run up against the limit of his interest, and had discovered there was no such limit, at least not yet. He told her about what he had seen in 5 years of riding, the territories he had moved through, the people he had encountered. He told her about the cattle trails and the mining camps and the small towns that existed for a season around a resource that had already peaked and were going to be ghost towns by the time the decade was out. He told her about the landscapes. He had always noticed landscapes more than perhaps a man was supposed to, and she did not make him feel strange about it. She asked him which was his favorite, and he thought about it seriously. A valley in Colorado in June, he said, with a creek running through it and the aspen trees just going green, everything so green it hurt. I have never been to Colorado, she said. You should go in June, he said, when Clara is old enough for the ride. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, yes, in the tone that held more than its syllable. On the afternoon of the 4th day they came down out of the last pass, and the Cimarron Valley opened below them, and Esther drew her horse up without speaking. The valley was laid out below in the afternoon light, brown and gold and green in different places, the mountains on either side giving it the shape of something cupped and kept. Even from this height, Emmett could see the line of fence that marked the western edge of her property, and a thread of smoke from a chimney somewhere in the buildings near what would be the ranch house. There is someone on the property, he said, his hand moving toward his gun by instinct. Yes, she said. I wired Mrs. Garza from Redemption. Elena Garza has been watching the house since the court order went through, making sure nothing was disturbed before I arrived. She paused, looking down at the valley. I am home, she said, and her voice did something complicated with the last word. Yes, he said. You are. She looked at him. He looked at the valley. And then she moved the bay mare forward, and he moved Calico beside her, and they rode down into the Cimarron Valley together in the long gold light of the late afternoon. Elena Garza was a woman of 40 with strong hands and a direct manner, and an expression of profound relief when she saw Esther ride into the yard. The 2 women embraced and spoke rapidly in both English and Spanish for several minutes, and there were tears on both sides, efficient tears, quickly dispatched. Elena had kept the house clean and the kitchen garden watered, and had left a supply of provisions that made both of them feel that they had the best possible neighbor. She was introduced to Emmett with an assessment that was frank and brief, and ended in something that was not yet approval but was not disapproval, which he took as a reasonable start. The south fence needs work, Elena told Esther. Hargrove's men ran cattle hard through there. The spring is fine, I checked it last week. The barn roof has a loose board on the east side that will need to be fixed before winter. Thank you, Esther said, for everything. "I will come back in a few days," Alina said, "when you have had time to find the ground under your feet." She looked at Emmett once more, nodded with something that had evolved slightly toward approval in the past 10 minutes, and rode back toward the Garza property. They stood in the yard of the ranch in the last of the daylight. The house was small but solid, adobe and timber, with a porch that ran the full length of the front and a view down the valley that in better light would have been remarkable. The barn was behind it, and there was a corral and a chicken coop that was empty but still standing, and two outbuildings of uncertain purpose but solid construction. "This is it," Esther said. "It is exactly as you described it," he said. She turned to look at him. The sun was nearly gone, and the sky above the mountains was a deep amber deepening to violet. "I have not described the inside," she said. "No," he said. "Tell me." She did, as they unsaddled the horses and settled them in the barn, as they brought their things inside, and Esther moved through the house with a lamp, touching surfaces and opening doors, her hands knowing every inch of the place and her face doing something private and layered that he tried not to intrude on. She described the kitchen, the sitting room, the two bedrooms, the second one that was Clara's with the small bed, and the drawings that Clara had made on paper and tacked to the wall before they left and that were still there, slightly faded, a horse and a sun, and a figure that was probably Esther herself. He did not stay in the house that night. He was sleeping in the barn, which was appropriate and expected, and he said so without it needing to be a statement about anything other than what it was. She brought him a blanket and a plate of food she had put together from Alina's provisions, and she stood in the barn doorway while he settled Calico and Belle for the night. "I am sending for Clara tomorrow," she said. "I will write first thing in the morning, and she should be here within the week." "I know," he said. "I look forward to meeting her." She stood in the doorway a moment longer. The dark outside was full of the sounds of the desert night, insects and a far owl, and the small movements of the land settling into cold. "Emmett," she said. He looked up from where he had been spreading the blanket. "I am glad you stopped on that road," she said. "I was not certain you would." "I was not certain I would either," he said. Something passed between them in the lamplight of the barn that was neither a promise nor a declaration, but was something before both of those things, something that was simply two people acknowledging what was true. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he said. In the morning, he got up before sunrise and assessed the south fence. She was right that it needed work. He found tools in the barn, good ones that had been well maintained before Hargrove's people had been working the place, and he began. He worked through the morning while she wrote letters inside and set the kitchen to rights and aired the bedding, and did all the 1,000 things that returning to a house that has been empty means doing. At noon, she brought food out to where he was working on the fence line, and sat on the top rail and ate beside him and looked at the land. "You did not have to start today," she said. "I wanted to," he said. "It needs to be done before winter, and winter in the mountains does not wait." She looked at the land stretching out ahead of them. "We should talk about cattle," she said. "I will need to rebuild the stock. Hargrove sold off what we had when he took the land and replaced it with his own animals, which the court confiscated. I have some savings from Santa Fe, and I think the Garza family may be willing to sell some breeding stock. I can go to Cimarron and see what is available at a fair price," he said. "I know horses well, but I can learn cattle if I do not already know enough." "You know enough," she said. "I can tell by the questions you asked on the road." They looked at the land together for a moment. "Esther," he said, "yes. I want to do this properly." He paused. "I do not mean the fence or the cattle. I mean all of it, whatever all of it means. I want to do it the right way at the right pace, and I am not trying to rush anything. But I want you to know that my intention is not temporary." She looked at him with the gray-green eyes that he had been cataloging without quite intending to for the past 3 weeks. "I know your intention is not temporary," she said. "Mine is not either." She paused. "Clara will be here by the end of the week. She is going to assess you with the full, unfiltered judgment of a 4-year-old, which is more rigorous than any I have yet encountered." "I am prepared to be assessed," he said. "We will see," she said, but she was smiling. Clara arrived on a Thursday, brought by Margaret's husband on the stage to Cimarron, and then in a hired wagon out to the ranch, and she descended from the wagon with the solemnity and purpose of someone who has thought carefully about how to handle a reunion and has a plan. She walked directly to Esther and allowed herself to be picked up and held, and she buried her face in her mother's neck for approximately 30 seconds, during which she made no sound, and then she lifted her head and looked at Emmett over her mother's shoulder. She was 4 years old and she had dark brown eyes exactly as described, very direct, and she had a small serious face and brown hair cut straight across, and she was wearing a red coat with brass buttons that was somewhat large for her, either because it was new or because it was intended to be grown into. She looked at Emmett with the thoroughness of a surveyor assessing a property. "Who are you?" she said. "My name is Emmett," he said. "I work here." She considered this. "Do you know about horses?" she said. "I do," he said. "Clara," Esther said, "this is my friend Emmett. He helped me get the ranch back." Clara looked at him a moment longer. "The gray horse in the barn," she said. "He is yours. His name is Calico." "That is a cat's name," she said. "He does not mind," Emmett said. Something in Clara's expression shifted slightly. It was not a smile, but it was the beginning of a willingness. She looked at her mother, seemed to make a decision, looked back at Emmett. "Can I see him?" she said. "Any time you want," he said. She nodded once with great gravity. Then she turned back to her mother and said, with the same gravity, "I removed all my crusts on the stage, and Aunt Margaret's husband said I was wasting good bread, and I told him I was not wasting it because I was eating the rest of it." Esther pressed her lips together in the way Emmett had come to recognize as her managing not to laugh. "That was very logical of you," she said. "I thought so," Clara said. The winter came on steadily, and Emmett worked the ranch with the focus that sustained hard physical work requires, and he was grateful for it. The south fence was repaired and a section of the north fence reinforced. The barn roof's loose board was fixed and the barn's general weatherproofing assessed and improved. He and Esther agreed on a small purchase of cattle from the Garza family, 8 head, a beginning, and over the following weeks he learned from Alina Garza's husband, a patient and skilled rancher named Ignacio, the specifics of cattle management in the Cimarron Valley, which had its own particular considerations of terrain and seasonal water. He was a quick study, and Ignacio was a good teacher, and they developed a working friendship that Emmett valued without needing to put particular words to. Clara decided she trusted him approximately 2 weeks after her arrival, the moment being identifiable by the fact that she stopped calling him that man to her mother and started calling him Emmett. She came to find him in the barn every morning to see Calico and the bay mare, and she had opinions about both horses that were specific and consistent. She told Emmett that Belle was a very good horse, and that Calico was also a very good horse, but that she did not understand why anyone would name a horse after a cat, and Emmett agreed that it was a question worth raising with whoever had originally named him. One afternoon in November in the barn, while he was repairing a piece of harness, and Clara was telling Calico in detailed terms about the book her aunt had sent her, she paused in the middle of a sentence and looked at Emmett with the direct brown eyes. "Are you going to stay?" she said. He stopped what he was doing. He looked at her, 4 years old and completely serious. "Yes," he said. "Good," she said. Then she turned back to Calico and continued her narrative. He sat in the barn afterward for a while, holding the harness and thinking about things that did not require words. He asked Esther to marry him in the kitchen on a December evening, which was not the romantic setting of a man who had planned it out, but was instead the setting of a man who had found his moment suddenly available and had learned, in the past several months, not to let moments of that kind pass by. She was making bread, which was a thing she did in the evenings when she was thinking, and the kitchen was warm and smelled of wood smoke and yeast, and the particular smell of the house that he had already come to know as well as he knew his own coat. He had come in from the barn and washed his hands, and she had looked up from the bread and said, "There is coffee," and he had poured 2 cups and turned around and said, "Esther, I want to marry you." She stopped what she was doing. She looked at him. She had flour on one hand and her hair was half down and the fire was behind her. "I know we have not been here very long," he said. "I know it has not been a year. I know you carry things that belong to someone who deserved them. I'm not asking you to put any of that down. I'm asking to be beside you while you carry it." He paused. "I am asking because I know what I want and I have learned that life is not organized in a way that guarantees tomorrow, and I would rather ask too soon than never ask at all." She looked at him for a long moment. The fire crackled. The bread waited. "Yes," she said. She said it the same way she had said yes when he told her he could see the ranch in the road ahead, with her eyes open and the full weight of what it meant behind it. He crossed the kitchen and kissed her for the first time, and it was exactly what it should have been, the convergence of everything that had been building since a road in New Mexico, and a woman who would not step aside. They were married in January in the small church in Cimarron, with the Garza family in attendance and Alina Garza weeping with the enthusiasm of a woman who had hoped for this since approximately the third day of Emmett's presence in the valley. Margaret and her husband came from Santa Fe for the occasion, and Clara wore a dress with a white collar and stood beside her mother during the ceremony with the bearing of a person taking part in an official proceeding, and taking it appropriately seriously. The minister was a man named Caldwell who had the good sense to say the necessary things and say them well without excess elaboration. And when he asked if anyone had reason to object to this marriage, Clara looked around the room with an expression that suggested she was taking the question literally and assessing whether anyone actually had such a reason. And finding the answer to be no, she gave a small nod and turned back to the front, which made the minister lose his composure briefly. After, there was a supper at the Garza house that lasted until well past midnight and involved music from two of the Garza cousins, and dancing that Emmett had not been aware he was expected to participate in, but participated in anyway, having discovered in the past months that Esther danced the way she did most things, with full attention and no performance, and that dancing with her required you to actually pay attention or be left behind. In the spring, Esther planted a kitchen garden that was the best she had ever managed, which she said was because she had finally gotten the soil preparation exactly right, and which Emmett suspected was also because she was happy, which has a way of making everything grow better. The cattle herd was expanded in April, 2 calves born in the spring and 6 more head purchased, and the ranch began to take on the quality of a going operation, not large, not wealthy, but real and functioning, and built on solid practice. Ignacio Garza said it was the best managed small operation in the valley, which was high praise from a man who did not distribute praise casually. Clara turned 5 in the summer and began to read, which she approached with the ferocity of someone given access to a large and interesting new territory. Emmett found himself reading to her in the evenings, and she had very specific opinions about which books were worth reading twice and which were not, and her criteria were entirely her own and could not always be predicted, and he loved this about her unreservedly. She started calling him Papa somewhere around midsummer, without announcement or ceremony, in the middle of a conversation about whether a particular fence post was leaning, or whether the ground around it was simply tilted. He did not make anything of it in the moment because she had not made anything of it, and he understood that to have made a thing of it would have been wrong. But he told Esther about it that evening, and she held his face in both hands and kissed him, and did not say anything else, which was exactly the right thing to do. In August of 1882, he received a letter from the Wyoming Territorial Marshal's office informing him that Cole Hargrove had been formally charged in the shooting of Daniel Brenner, that the charges were on the official record, that the matter would be taken up by the Wyoming courts upon the completion of the New Mexico sentence, and that the case was considered closed pending that process. There was no satisfaction in it that was loud or triumphant. The satisfaction was quiet, like the closing of a door that has been standing open for too long, the particular piece of a room that has finally been put in order. He read the letter twice, sitting on the porch in the morning, and then he folded it and put it in the inside pocket of his coat where he kept things that mattered. He sat for a while and thought about Daniel, not about the card game or the man who had taken his life, but about Daniel himself, 22 and full of plans, and about what Daniel would have made of the valley in the morning light, the mountains and the sage and the sound of Esther singing something half-remembered in the kitchen while she made breakfast. He thought Daniel would have liked it very much. He thought Daniel, who had wanted to build something good in Colorado, would have understood it entirely. "Come eat," Esther called from inside. He stood up. He went inside. The kitchen was warm and the bread was fresh, and Clara was already at the table with a book propped against the pitcher, reading and eating simultaneously in a way that was technically against the rule, but that neither of them ever quite enforced because watching her read was its own kind of pleasure. He sat down and ate breakfast with his wife and his daughter in the house they were building a life in, and the morning was exactly what a morning should be. And outside the window the Cimarron Valley went on being the color of everything good and particular. In the autumn of 1883, their son was born on a Tuesday afternoon in October, delivered by the midwife from Cimarron while Emmett sat in the kitchen and was steadier than he expected to be, which Esther told him afterward she had counted on. They had discussed names at length and could not entirely agree, and so when the midwife came to the kitchen doorway and said the baby was here and everything was fine and he should come now, and he went in and found Esther holding a red and furious and thoroughly present small person with dark hair, she looked up at him and said, "Well," he looked at his son. He looked at her. "Daniel," he said. She had not suggested the name. Neither had he. Came out of him the way things come out when they are true, without preparation, without explanation needed. She looked at the baby for a moment and then back at him. "Daniel Emmett Brenner," she said. "Yes," he said. Clara, who had been brought in by the midwife and was standing just inside the door with the precise focus of a person evaluating a new development, leaned forward slightly and inspected the baby. "He is very small," she said. "He will get bigger," Esther said. "I know," Clara said. "That is what happened with the Garza baby." She tilted her head. "He looks like Papa." Emmett looked up. Clara was looking at him with the dark, direct eyes, and there was something in her expression that was proud about this, that was pleased, as if the resemblance was a good outcome she was noting for the record. "Does he?" he said. "Around the eyes," she said with authority. He looked at Daniel Emmett Brenner, who had stopped being furious and was now simply intensely present. And he thought about what it meant that Clara saw him when she looked at his son. And he thought about roads that end and roads that begin, and the extraordinary turn that a life can take when you stop because a woman is standing in the road, and you cannot find it in yourself to go around her. "He looks like his mother," Emmett said. "He looks like both of you," Clara said, in the tone of someone providing a more accurate assessment. She came fully into the room and stood beside Emmett and looked at the baby, and then, with the solemnity of a person making a significant investment, she put her finger in Daniel's hand and his fingers closed around it. Her face did something entirely new, something that had no assessment or precision in it at all, something that was simply wonder. It was the most honest expression Emmett had ever seen on a human face. He looked at Esther. She was watching Clara, with tears on her face that she was not managing at all, and smiling the full smile that had been rare in redemption, and that he had watched grow more frequent through the months, and that was by now the most familiar and most necessary thing in his world. He sat on the edge of the bed beside her. She leaned her shoulder against his. Daniel made a small, decisive sound. Clara told him quietly and seriously that it was fine and she was here, which was both very funny and very true. Outside the window of the ranch house bedroom, the Cimarron Valley was going through its October changes, the cottonwoods along the creek going gold, the grasses turning amber, the mountains gathering the first of their winter white at the peaks. It was the most beautiful time of year in this particular valley, which already had strong competition from itself in every other season, and the light of the late afternoon was doing what the light always did here, which was to make everything look like something worth keeping. Emmett thought about the road outside Redemption with the red clay and the woman standing in the center of it, holding a sign with the word help in letters desperate enough to stop a man who had been riding toward murder for 5 years. He thought about stopping. He thought about what it had cost him to stop and what it had given him, and there was no way to weigh those things against each other because they did not occupy the same scale. What he had lost was already lost before he stopped. What he had gained by stopping was sitting beside him with her shoulder warm against his, with their son in her arms and their daughter standing guard against all uncertainty. He had ridden toward that man with murder in his heart for 5 years. She had been standing in the road. He had not gone around her. Everything after that had been the story. This quiet kitchen, this valley, this family. The story he would still be living when he was old. The story he would tell Daniel when Daniel was old enough to ask. The story that began with a gray horse and a dry ditch, and a woman who understood that some roads require someone to stand in the middle of them and refuse to let ruin pass. Daniel opened his eyes briefly, dark and unfocused and entirely new to the world, and Emmett looked at him and thought, "Hello, brother. Hello, son. We will take good care of each other." The evening settled over the Cimarron Valley. In the kitchen, the fire was still warm. On the porch, the last light was gold on the mountains. In the room with the east-facing window that Esther had chosen for exactly this, the light came in and touched everything with the particular tenderness of October, and the family it found there was complete,